Most people don't think about what happens after something bad enough to make the news. They see the flashing lights, the tape, maybe a blurred photo online, and then they move on. By the next day, it's just another headline, pushed down by something newer. But the places where those things happen, they don't fix themselves. Someone has to go in after everything is over. That's where people like me come in. I don't work for a company. No uniform, no logo on a van, nothing official that would make someone feel better about what I do. I get calls, usually from numbers that don't show up twice. And I show up where I'm told. Cash, always, no paperwork, no names. It wasn't something I planned. I fell into it the way people fall into most things. Slowly, and then all at once. A friend of a friend needed help cleaning out an apartment years ago. Said it paid well and didn't ask questions. I needed the money more than I needed details. After that, more calls came. Different places. Same kind of work. Eventually, it just became what I do. There are rules, even if no one says them out loud. You don't ask what happened. You don't look too closely at anything you don't need to clean. You don't stay longer than necessary. And most importantly, you don't let it follow you home. That last one sounds simple. It isn't. Not really. You get used to certain things. The smell, mostly. It's hard to describe if you haven't been around it. Easy to recognize once you have. It sticks to the air, to the walls, to you. Bleach helps, but it never really goes away. Not completely. I've seen all kinds of places. Small apartments, quiet suburban houses. Once, even a storage unit that someone had been living in without anyone knowing. Each one tells a story. Even if you're trying not to listen, you start to notice patterns, the way things are left behind, the small details people forget matter. I've learned to keep my focus narrow. Just the job, just the surface in front of me. If you start thinking about the people who were there before you, it slows you down. And slowing down is how you start making mistakes. Most of the time, it's straightforward. You go in, you clean, you leave. Sometimes there are things missing. A body already taken away. Furniture removed. But that's normal. You don't question it. You just work with what's left. The calls usually come at odd hours, late at night, early morning. Times when most people wouldn't answer. I always do. If you hesitate too long, and the job goes to someone else. And in this line of work, you don't pass up steady money. The pay is good. Better than most jobs I could get without explaining gaps in my past. I don't feel like explaining. There's a kind of simplicity to it. No coworkers, no meetings, no expectations beyond finishing what you started. Still, every now and then, something feels off. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing you could point to and say, that's wrong. It's smaller than that. A feeling that settles in the back of your mind while you're working, like you've missed something. Even when everything looks clean. I've learned to ignore that feeling, because the moment you start paying attention to it, you start noticing things you can't explain. And once that happens, the job stops being just a job. The call that didn't feel right. The call came later than usual, close to 3 a.m. That wasn't strange on its own. Most of my work happens when the rest of the world is asleep. What stood out was how quickly the phone stopped ringing, like whoever was on the other end expected me to miss it. I picked up on the second ring. For a moment, there was nothing. No background noise, no breathing, not even the faint static you usually get from a bad connection. Just silence. Clean and empty. Like the line hadn't connected properly. Then the voice came through. It wasn't distorted, not exactly, clear enough to understand. but flat in a way that felt rehearsed, like someone repeating lines they hadn't written. "There's a job," it said. No greeting, no name. That wasn't unusual either. But something about the timing felt deliberate, like the pause before it had been measured. I sat up, already reaching for the small notebook I keep by the bed. "Where?" I asked. Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Address will be sent. Payment upon completion." The way it spoke didn't change. Same tone, same pacing, no hesitation, no variation. Most people, even the ones trying to stay anonymous, have something in their voice that gives them away. Stress, urgency, impatience. This had none of that. "How big is the job?" I asked. Silence again. Then, "Standard." That wasn't an answer. It was the kind of response you give when you don't want to explain anything. I've had clients like that before, but usually they at least pretend to cooperate. I almost hung up. But then it said the number, the payment. It was higher than anything I'd been offered before. Not by a small margin either. Enough to cover months of work in one night. Enough to make most questions feel less important. I didn't respond right away. The voice didn't rush me. It just waited. "Fine," I said eventually. "Send the address." "Do not delay," it replied. The call ended immediately after that. No confirmation, no closing words, just silence, like it had never been there. A message came through a few seconds later. No contact name, just a string of numbers and an address underneath. I looked at it for a while before doing anything else. There was something about the way it had been given to me. Not the words themselves, the gaps between them. Too consistent, too controlled. I told myself it didn't matter. Work is work. Still, I checked the number. It didn't exist. Not even as a blocked ID. Just empty. Like the call had been routed through something that didn't leave a trace. That wasn't new, but it didn't feel normal either. I got up, started packing my kit the way I always do. Gloves, chemicals, extra lights, everything in its place. Routine helps keep things simple. It gives you something to focus on. But I kept thinking about the voice, not what it said, just how it sounded. Flat, measured. Almost like it wasn't reacting to me at all. As I grabbed my keys, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This one didn't have an address, just a single line. "You've been here before." I stared at it longer than I should have, because I knew for a fact I hadn't. An address that shouldn't be there. I didn't leave right away. That message stayed on my screen longer than I'd like to admit. "You've been here before." It didn't make sense. Not in any way that felt real. I keep records, even if they're minimal. Addresses, dates, nothing personal, just enough to avoid overlap. I didn't recognize this one. Still, I checked. I flipped through the notebook on my desk, page by page, scanning the shorthand I use to keep things quick. Nothing matched. No similar street name, no duplicate number. It wasn't familiar. That should have been enough. It wasn't. I copied the address into my phone and opened my usual map app. The screen paused for a second, like it was trying to decide what to do with it. Then it returned nothing. No pin, no suggestion, just a blank grid where the location should have been. I tried again, slower this time. Same result. That happens sometimes. With new developments. Places too far out to be properly listed. So, I switched to a different app, then another. Same outcome each time. It wasn't just missing. It was like the address didn't belong anywhere. I zoomed out, trying to place the general area manually. The street name showed up eventually, but it was faint, tucked between long stretches of unmarked land. No nearby landmarks, no businesses, nothing that would explain why anyone would build a house out there. It looked avoided. I checked satellite view. At first, I thought it hadn't loaded, just a smear of color, slightly off from the surrounding terrain. Then it sharpened, slowly, resolving into something that might have been a structure. The image quality dropped the closer I zoomed in, like it didn't want to be seen clearly. There was a house, or at least something shaped like one, square, simple. No visible driveway, no cars, no sign of life. The yard around it looked untouched, like no one had walked across it in years. Even the trees nearby seemed spaced too evenly, as if they'd been arranged rather than grown. I leaned back, staring at the screen. There are places that don't show up properly. Old roads, abandoned properties, things that slip through updates. But this felt different. Less like it had been missed, more like it had been left out. I checked the coordinates manually, tracing the route I'd have to take. The path led off the main road after a few miles, turning into something narrower, less maintained. Eventually, it stopped being a road altogether, just a line cutting through empty land. No alternate routes, no nearby houses, no reason for anyone to be out there. I told myself that was the point: privacy, distance. People with money and problems tend to prefer places like that, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one asks questions. That part made sense. What didn't was the message. I looked at it again. It hadn't changed. Same words, same timestamp. You've been here before. I tried to think if maybe I'd cleaned somewhere nearby. Maybe I just didn't remember. It happens sometimes. The jobs blur together if you don't let them settle. But even then, I would have recognized something. Wouldn't I? I closed the apps and slipped the phone into my pocket. At a certain point, you stop digging. Not because you're satisfied, but because digging doesn't give you anything useful. It just creates more questions you can't answer, and questions don't pay. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside, locked the door behind me. The air felt colder than it should have for that time of night. Quiet, too. No cars, no distant noise, nothing moving. For a second, I hesitated, not enough to turn back, just enough to notice. Then I got in the car and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, my phone lit up again. Same number, same blank contact, another message. This time, it was just a time. No explanation, no context. And somehow, I already knew. I wasn't supposed to be late. First step inside. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sky had started to lighten, but not enough to feel like morning. That in-between hour where everything looks flatter than it should. Colors dull, edges softer. Easy to miss things if you're not paying attention. The main road ended without much warning. One moment, it was pavement. The next, it narrowed into something rougher, barely maintained. I slowed down, checking the address again, even though I already knew I was in the right place. There weren't any signs, no markers, nothing to confirm it except the route I'd traced earlier. The further I drove, the quieter it got. No houses, no fences, not even power lines. Just open land stretching out on both sides, uneven and still. The kind of place people don't build unless they have a reason to stay hidden. I kept expecting to see something. Another car, maybe. Tire tracks. But the ground looked untouched. Eventually, the road stopped. Not gradually, just ended. The house was there, a short distance ahead, sitting alone like it had always been there, and everything else had moved away from it. It looked exactly like it had on the satellite image. Same shape, same stillness. I parked and stayed in the car for a moment longer than I needed to. From a distance, it didn't look wrong, just old, maybe neglected. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing. The front yard was bare, the grass uneven but not overgrown. No movement anywhere. I grabbed my kit and stepped out. The air felt heavier out there, not colder, not warmer, just dense, like it pressed a little more than it should. Sound didn't carry properly either. My footsteps felt muted, even on the gravel. I approached the front door, already noticing the small things. No mailbox, no house number, no signs of recent use, but no signs of decay either. It wasn't abandoned. It just didn't feel lived in. The door was slightly open. That wasn't unusual in my line of work. Sometimes people leave things unlocked to avoid attention. Still, I knocked once, out of habit more than expectation. No response. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The smell hit first, faint but familiar, not strong enough to be fresh, but present enough that it hadn't been there long. It settled into the back of my throat, dull and persistent. I stepped inside. The lighting was low, natural light filtering through the windows in thin, uneven strips. Dust floated in the air, slow and undisturbed. The layout was simple. Living room straight ahead, hallway to the right, kitchen off to the left. Everything looked normal, furniture in place, nothing overturned, no immediate signs of what I'd been called here for. I set my kit down near the door and moved further in. It didn't take long to find it. A dark stain on the floor, partially dried, leading toward the hallway. Not large, but enough to tell me what kind of job this was. There were smaller marks nearby, scattered in a way that suggested movement, struggle, maybe. Hard to tell without seeing more. I followed the trail slowly. Each step felt louder than it should have. Even though the house itself stayed quiet, no creaks, no shifting, nothing reacting to me being there. That was the first thing that felt off. Most places make noise. Old wood, loose fixtures, something settling under your weight. This place didn't respond at all. The hallway stretched further than I expected, not by much, just enough that I noticed. There were doors on either side, all closed. The stain led past them, deeper into the house. I kept going, trying not to think about how the light behind me seemed to dim the further I moved away from the entrance. I told myself it was just the angle. At the end of the hallway, the trail stopped. Not faded. Stopped, right in front of a closed door. I stood there for a moment, looking down at it, then back at the door, and something about it felt deliberate, like whatever had happened here hadn't ended. It had just moved somewhere else. And for the first time since I arrived, I started to wonder what exactly I was supposed to be cleaning. The blood doesn't stay gone. I started in the living room. That's usually how I handle places like this. Work from the outside in, clear the obvious areas first, then move deeper once I understand the layout. It keeps things predictable, or at least it's supposed to. I unpacked my kit, set everything out the way I always do. Gloves first, then the solution, clean cloths, sealed and folded. The routine matters more than people think. It gives your hands something to follow when your mind starts drifting. The stain near the hallway was the first target. Up close, it looked fresh enough to respond quickly, not completely set, not completely dry. I sprayed the surface, waited a few seconds, then wiped. It came up easily, too easily, if anything. The kind of job you finish faster than expected. I moved over it again, just to be sure. Nothing left. I stood up, looked around, trying to decide where to go next. The rest of the room was clean. No signs of struggle, no hidden spots. It didn't match the trail I'd followed in. I glanced back at the floor. The stain was there again. Not fully, just a faint outline, like something bleeding through from underneath. I stared at it for a second, trying to figure out if I'd missed it the first time. That happens sometimes. Certain materials absorb more than they should. You clean the surface, and the deeper layer pushes back through. I knelt down and wiped it again. Same result. Gone. I stayed there a little longer this time, watching the spot, waiting to see if it changed. Nothing happened. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and stood up. Probably just the lighting. This place didn't have great visibility, and the angle from the windows kept shifting as the sun came up. I moved into the hallway. The trail was clearer here, more defined, a line dragging slightly to the right, like something heavy had been pulled. I followed it, working section by section, careful not to rush, spray, wait, wipe, same process, over and over. It felt normal, almost. But every time I moved forward, I had the sense that something behind me had shifted. Not enough to hear, just enough to notice when I stopped thinking about the work. I ignored it. That's part of the job, too. You focus on what's in front of you. You don't turn around unless you have a reason. After a while, I went back to check the living room again. I don't usually double back that early, but something about the space felt unfinished, like I'd skipped a step without realizing it. The stain was back, darker this time. Not just an outline, not just a shadow. It looked closer to how it had when I first saw it. Maybe not as heavy, but enough that it stood out against the floor. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, looking at it, trying to work through the possibilities. Bad flooring, old damage, residue pushing up through the surface. All of that made sense. What didn't make sense was how fast it was happening. I checked my watch. Only a few minutes had passed. That wasn't enough time for anything to resurface like that. Not naturally. I crouched down again. Slower this time, and wiped the stain for the third time. It came up just as easily. No resistance, no leftover marks. Clean. I stayed there longer, watching it, waiting. At first, nothing changed. Then, slowly, the color began to return. Not all at once. A thin line, right at the center, spreading outward. I pulled my hand back without thinking. It wasn't just soaking through. It was forming, like something underneath was pushing it up, shaping it into place. I stood up, stepping away from the spot. The rest of the room stayed still. The air didn't change. The light didn't shift. Just that one area on the floor, darkening piece by piece, as if it had never been cleaned at all. I looked down at the cloth in my hand. Still damp, still stained from the first pass, which meant I had removed something. So why was it back? I turned slowly, scanning the room again, this time paying closer attention to the edges, the corners, the spaces I hadn't checked before. Everything else was exactly where it had been, unchanged, untouched, except for that one spot. I backed toward the hallway, keeping my eyes on it. It didn't move. It didn't spread beyond its original shape. It just settled, like it had found where it was supposed to be. And for the first time since I started the job, I had a thought that didn't fit with anything I knew. Maybe I wasn't cleaning something that had happened. Maybe I was trying to clean something that was still happening. The voice that knows too much. I didn't call anyone. That's not something I do, even when a job starts to feel wrong. You learn early that involving other people complicates things. Questions get asked. Details get picked apart. And in my line of work, details are usually what you're trying to avoid. Still, I stepped outside for a minute. The air felt different once I crossed the doorway. Lighter, maybe. Or just easier to breathe. I hadn't realized how heavy it felt inside until I wasn't there anymore. I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't surprising given the location, but it didn't sit right either. I'd had enough coverage earlier to receive messages, enough for the call to come through. Now there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, looking back at the house. From the outside, it hadn't changed. Same stillness, same empty windows, no movement anywhere. If not for the open door, it could have passed for abandoned. I told myself to finish the job and leave. That was the simplest solution. Clean what I could, collect the payment, forget the rest. I stepped back inside. The smell hit again, slightly stronger this time. Not overwhelming, just more present, like it had settled deeper into the walls while I was outside. I moved straight to the living room. The stain was still there, not spreading, not changing, just existing, exactly where it had been before. I didn't approach it this time. Instead, I turned and headed down the hallway, focusing on the trail that led deeper into the house. If the front room wasn't going to stay clean, then there wasn't much point in starting there. Better to see what I was actually dealing with. I had just reached the first door on the left when my phone vibrated. The sound felt louder than it should have in that space. I froze for a second before pulling it out. Same number, no ID. I let it ring once, then answered. This time, the silence didn't last as long. You missed a section. The voice was the same as before, flat, controlled, but there was something else under it now, a slight delay between the words, like they were being processed before being spoken. I just got here, I said. A pause. Then, the living room. I glanced back toward it without turning fully around. I cleaned it. No, the voice replied. You didn't. The way it said it wasn't defensive. It wasn't even corrective. Just certain. I tightened my grip on the phone. I wiped the entire floor. There's nothing left. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, look again. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen. No signal. No call log. Nothing to confirm it had even happened. Slowly, I turned back toward the living room. From where I stood, I could only see part of the floor. But that was enough. The stain was darker. Not just more visible, different. The edges had spread slightly, extending beyond where it had been before. Subtle, but clear if you knew what to look for. I walked back, slower this time. Each step felt heavier than it should have, like the floor wasn't responding the same way under my weight. I stopped a few feet away from the spot. Up close, it didn't look like a simple stain anymore. It had shape, not defined, not clear enough to make out anything specific. But it wasn't random. It looked like something had settled there, or something had been placed there. I crouched down without thinking, bringing the cloth back out. For a second, I hesitated, not because I was afraid, just unsure. Then I wiped it again. The surface cleared immediately. Same as before, I clean. I stayed there, watching, waiting. A few seconds passed. Nothing. Then my phone vibrated again. A message this time. No number, no contact, just text. Don't fall behind. I looked down at the floor. A thin line had already started to form again, right where I'd wiped, faint but growing. I straightened up slowly, scanning the room. Something about the space felt tighter now. Not smaller, exactly, just closer. Like the walls had shifted inward without moving. I glanced back toward the hallway. It looked longer than it had before. Not by much, just enough that I noticed. I turned back to the stain. It had spread a little further, not fast, but steady, like it wasn't reacting to me anymore, like it was following its own pace. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into something logical, but the more I looked, the harder that became, because the voice hadn't just been watching, it had known, not what I had done, what I hadn't done. And that meant one thing I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't the only one inside the house. Rooms that shouldn't exist. I didn't go back to the living room after that, not right away. There's a point where repeating the same action stops being productive. You start chasing something instead of finishing it, and whatever was happening in that room, it wasn't something I could fix by standing there longer. So I turned back to the hallway. The trail was still there, leading deeper in, but it looked different now, slightly wider, the edges less defined, like it had been disturbed. I couldn't tell if that was because of me or something else. I moved forward anyway. The first door on the left was slightly open, like I was sure it hadn't been before. I would have noticed. I always check door positions when I enter a new space. It's habit. I pushed it open slowly. A bedroom, small, simple, bed against the far wall, sheets half pulled off like someone had left in a hurry. No visible stains, no signs of damage. It didn't match the rest of the house. Too clean. I stepped inside, scanning the floor, the corners, the ceiling. Nothing, no smell either. Not like the rest of the place. The air felt neutral, like this room didn't belong. I backed out and closed the door behind me. The hallway felt narrower when I turned around. Not enough to trap me, just enough to make me aware of the walls. I kept walking, counting the doors this time without meaning to. One on the left, one on the right, another on the left. Then I stopped. There hadn't been that many before. I was sure of it. I turned slowly, looking back toward the entrance. The door I'd come through was still there, but further away than it should have been. The space between felt stretched, like the distance had been pulled thin. I blinked, expecting it to correct itself. It didn't. I looked forward again. There was a new section of hallway ahead. Not an extension exactly. More like it had been slotted in, seamlessly. As if it had always been there, and I just hadn't noticed. The lighting changed slightly the further I looked. Darker, not because of shadows, but because there was less light to begin with. I took a step forward, then another. The floor didn't creak. The walls didn't shift. The house stayed completely still around me, like it was waiting. I reached the next door and opened it without thinking. Another room. This one wasn't clean. The smell hit immediately, stronger than before, heavier, settled deep into the space. The floor was marked, not in a single place, across the entire surface. Dark patches, uneven, layered like they'd been there longer. Furniture was overturned, a chair on its side, one leg broken. The kind of damage that doesn't come from a single moment. It builds. I didn't step inside. I just stood in the doorway, taking it in. This wasn't the same scene as before. It couldn't be. Different layout, different damage, different everything. And yet it was connected. The same kind of work, the same kind of aftermath. I closed the door. My hand lingered on the handle longer than it should have. When I pulled it away, there was something on my glove. A faint smear. Fresh. I looked down at it, then back at the door. I hadn't touched anything inside. At least, I didn't think I had. I wiped my glove on a cloth, slow and deliberate. Then turned back to the hallway. There were more doors now. I didn't remember seeing them before. They lined both sides, evenly spaced, stretching further than I could see clearly. Each one closed, each one identical. The trail on the floor didn't lead to just one anymore. It split, thin lines branching off in different directions, like something had been dragged through multiple paths at once. I stood there, trying to piece it together. Layouts don't change, rooms don't appear, hallways don't stretch. Not like this, but everything in front of me said otherwise. I took a step back, then another. The distance behind me didn't shorten. If anything, it felt longer, like the house wasn't just adding space, it was rearranging it, quietly, carefully, as if it didn't want me to notice. But I had. And once you notice something like that, you can't pretend it's just a job anymore. You can't leave early. I decided to leave, not because I was panicking, not yet. But there's a point where a job stops being worth finishing, no matter the pay. I'd crossed that point somewhere between the second room and the hallway that shouldn't exist. I turned around and started walking back the way I came. At first, nothing felt wrong. The hallway behind me looked the same, longer than before, but still leading in the direction of the front door. I kept my pace steady, not rushing, just moving with purpose. The doors on either side stayed closed. That was new. I didn't remember closing them. I didn't remember them being closed at all. I kept walking. The distance didn't feel right. It should have taken less time to reach the end. I wasn't counting steps, but I could tell I'd gone further than I should have. The entrance should have been in sight by now. It wasn't. I slowed down, looked back over my shoulder. The hallway behind me stretched out just as far as the one ahead. Same doors, same spacing. No difference between where I'd been and where I was going. I stopped completely. For a moment I considered turning around again, just to test it, but something about that felt pointless, like the house had already made its decision. I kept going forward. Eventually, the light changed. Slightly brighter ahead, the kind of shift that tells you you're getting closer to an open space. I moved faster without meaning to, drawn toward it more out of habit than hope. The hallway opened into the living room, the same one I'd started in, same furniture, same placement, same stain on the floor. I stood at the threshold, not stepping in. That shouldn't have been possible. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't passed any intersections. There was no way the hallway should have looped like that. I backed away slowly. The hallway behind me hadn't changed. Still long, still lined with doors. I turned and walked again. This time, faster, not running, just enough to close the distance quicker. The walls didn't blur. The floor didn't shift. Everything stayed exactly as it was. Too steady, too controlled. After a while, I saw the front door. Open, just like I'd left it. Light coming through from outside. Pale and flat. I didn't hesitate this time. I crossed the living room, stepped over the edge of the stain without looking down, and went straight for the exit. The moment I passed through the doorway, something felt off. Not immediately, just enough to slow me down. I stepped outside and stopped. The yard was wrong. It looked the same at first glance. Same uneven ground. Same empty space stretching outward. But the angle was different. The horizon sat lower, like I was standing on a slight incline that hadn't been there before. I turned around. The house behind me was the same. Door open, windows dark. Nothing changed. I took a few steps forward, away from it. The ground didn't feel right under my feet. Too even, too consistent, like it wasn't real soil, just something shaped to look like it. I kept walking, 5 steps, 10. Then I stopped. The house was still behind me, closer than it should have been. I hadn't gone far, but I'd moved enough that it should have looked smaller. It didn't. I turned fully this time, facing it. The door was still open, exactly the same distance away as before. I looked down at the ground. No footprints, not mine, not anything. I walked again, faster now. The distance didn't change. The house stayed where it was, or maybe I stayed where I was. I stopped again, breathing a little heavier than before. Then I turned back toward the door. It felt easier, not right, just easier, like the effort of moving away was heavier than moving toward it. I stepped back inside without thinking too much about it. The moment I crossed the threshold, the weight lifted slightly, not gone, just reduced. I closed the door behind me this time. The sound didn't echo. It didn't carry at all. I stood there, hands still on the handle, staring into the living room, at the stain. It was darker now, wider, and closer to the center of the room than before. I didn't need to test it again, didn't need to try the hallway. The message was clear enough. Leaving wasn't something I could choose, not yet. I looked down at my hands, still in gloves, still holding the cloth I'd been using. Then back at the room, at the stain, at the space that refused to stay clean. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't a job I could walk away from. It was something I had to finish, or something that wasn't going to let me leave at all. I didn't test the door again. There wasn't any point. The house had already shown me how that would go. Instead, I stood in the living room and looked at the floor, at the stain that refused to stay gone. It had spread further while I'd been trying to leave. The edges darker now, more defined, like it had settled into place. I stepped around it carefully and picked up my kit. If leaving wasn't an option, then finishing was the only thing that made sense. That's how these jobs work. You complete what you're given and things return to normal. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. I knelt down again and started cleaning. Same process, same movements, slow, controlled, methodical. I didn't rush it this time. I paid attention to every inch, every small detail. If something was being missed, I wanted to know where. The stain came up easily. Again, but this time, I didn't move on. I stayed there, watching the surface, waiting for it to come back. My hand hovered just above the floor, cloth ready. Seconds passed. Nothing changed. I waited longer. Still nothing. I stood up slowly, eyes still fixed on the spot. For the first time since I arrived, it stayed clean. I didn't feel relieved, just aware. I turned toward the hallway. The trail was still there, leading deeper in, branching into those new sections I hadn't fully explored. I followed it, slower than before, more deliberate. The first room on the right was open now. I didn't remember opening it. Inside, The scene was worse than the others, the damage more concentrated, the smell stronger. This was where most of the work would be. I stepped in, closing the door behind me without thinking. The room felt tighter once it was shut, not smaller, just contained. I set my kit down and got to work. It took longer this time. The stains were heavier, layered into the floor and walls, and I had to go over the same spots multiple times, working them out slowly. Every time I thought I was finished, something new appeared, just beyond where I'd cleaned. A smear on the baseboard, a mark on the edge of the bed frame. Details I hadn't noticed before. I stayed with it, didn't move on, didn't rush. Eventually the room started to change, not physically, just the feeling of it. The air felt lighter, the smell faded slightly, the space didn't press in as much. I stepped back, looking around carefully. Everything was clean, completely clean. I waited. Nothing came back. No new stains, no movement, just stillness. I reached for the door and opened it. The hallway outside looked different. Not changed exactly, just quieter, more stable. The doors were still there, but the spacing felt right again. The distance between them made sense in a way it hadn't before. I stepped out, leaving the room behind me. The trail on the floor had shortened, not gone, but reduced, like something had been removed from it. I moved to the next section, following what remained. Same process, same care. I didn't skip anything, every corner, every surface. If there was even a chance something had been missed, I went back over it. It took time, more than I expected. But each time I finished a section, the house responded the same way, subtle, but consistent. The air eased, the space held still. The distance between rooms stopped shifting. I started to understand. It wasn't about cleaning everything at once. It was about finishing what was in front of me, completely. No shortcuts, no assumptions. I moved back toward the living room after clearing the hallway. The stain was gone, not faded, not reduced, gone. The floor looked exactly like it had when I first walked in, before I'd seen anything out of place. I stood there, taking it in. The house felt quieter, not empty, just less active, like it was waiting, but not for the same reason as before. I glanced down at my hands, then back at the room. The pattern was clear now. If I left something unfinished, it came back. If I rushed, it spread. If I ignored it, it got worse. But if I finished it, really finished it, the house settled. I didn't know why, didn't know what it meant, but I knew enough. I looked toward the deeper part of the hallway, where the newer sections had formed. There was more work waiting, more than I'd seen yet, and something told me if I missed even one part of it, the house wouldn't just reset, it would make sure I noticed. The second rule, don't look too long. The next room wasn't like the others. I knew that before I even stepped inside. The door was already open, just slightly, enough to show a narrow slice of the space beyond. There was no trail leading into it, no visible stains from the hallway. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have skipped it entirely. But after everything I'd seen, skipping anything didn't feel like an option. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell was different, not stronger, not weaker, just different. Less like something that had happened, more like something that had been sitting there for a long time. The room itself was small, bare mostly. No furniture except for a chair placed near the center. It faced the far wall, positioned too precisely to feel accidental. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The air felt still, not heavy like before, just unmoving. I set my kit down and took a step forward. That's when I noticed it. The shape on the chair. At first, I thought it was just a pile of fabric, something draped over the seat, left behind. The lighting made it hard to see clearly, shadows stretching across it in uneven lines. Then I realized it wasn't fabric. It was a body, sitting upright, head tilted slightly forward, arms resting at its sides. The posture looked natural in a way that didn't make sense. Too balanced, too intentional. I stopped moving. There were no visible wounds, no blood on the floor around it, nothing that explained why it was there. I told myself it wasn't part of the job, that it had already been handled, that I didn't need to focus on it. So, I didn't. I turned slightly, directing my attention to the walls, the floor, the corners of the room. There were faint marks, barely visible unless you looked closely. Thin streaks along the baseboards, small spots near the edge of the door frame. That's what I started with. Spray, wait, wipe, same as before. I kept my movement steady, controlled, careful not to let my focus drift. The body stayed in my peripheral vision, just at the edge, where I could ignore it without pretending it wasn't there. It didn't move. Not at first. I worked my way around the room, cleaning each mark as I found it. The space responded the same way as the others, slowly stabilizing. The air feeling less dense with each section, I finished. But something was off, not in the room, in me. A pull, subtle, but persistent. The urge to look, not directly, just enough to confirm what I already knew, to check if it had changed, if it had shifted, if it was still sitting there the same way. I ignored it, kept working, moved to the next section. Another mark, another pass. The pull didn't go away. It got stronger. I could feel it in the back of my mind, like a thought I hadn't finished. The longer I avoided it, the more it pressed in. Quiet, but insistent. I tightened my grip on the cloth and focused on the floor. Just the floor, nothing else. A few more passes, a few more minutes. Then I looked, just for a second. That was all it took. The head had moved. Not much, just enough that it wasn't angled the same way anymore. I froze. My eyes stayed on it longer than they should have. The tilt was different, slightly higher, like it had lifted. I told myself I was imagining it, that I hadn't paid enough attention before, that the lighting had shifted. All reasonable, all possible. I looked away. Immediately, my chest felt tighter now, breathing slower, more controlled. I went back to the wall, forcing myself to focus on the work. But it was harder now. The pull had changed. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was awareness. The kind you get when you know something is behind you, even if you can't see it. I finished the last section near the door and stepped back. The room felt stable, clean, like the others had when I was done. I reached for my kit, keeping my movements slow, careful, deliberate. I didn't look at the chair again. I didn't need to. I already knew what I'd see, or worse, what I wouldn't. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The moment I crossed the threshold, the pressure eased slightly. Not gone, just reduced. I closed the door behind me without turning around, and as I stood there, staring down the length of the hallway, one thought settled in quietly. Without resistance. It wasn't enough to ignore what was in the room. You had to avoid acknowledging it, because the moment you gave it your attention, it started giving something back. Evidence. I was never here before. By the time I reached the next section of the hallway, I'd stopped expecting things to make sense. That helped more than I thought it would. If you don't try to explain something, it loses some of its weight. It becomes a task instead of a problem. And tasks, no matter how strange, can be finished. I followed the remaining trail, working through smaller sections now. Yet the stains were lighter here, easier to handle. Each one came up without resistance. And for a while, the house stayed still. No new rooms, no shifting walls, just quiet. It almost felt normal again. That's when I found the first sign. It was near the end of the hallway, just before it opened into another room. A small object on the floor, half hidden against the baseboard. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been checking everything carefully. I crouched down and picked it up. A glove, latex, powdered, same brand I use. I turned it over in my hand. There was a tear near the thumb, not clean, stretched, like it had caught on something sharp. I checked my own gloves, both intact, no damage. I looked back at the one I was holding. It wasn't new. There were faint marks along the surface, slight discoloration from use. Not enough to tell where it had been used, but enough to know it hadn't just come out of a box. I set it down slowly. That didn't mean anything, not by itself. This wasn't the kind of job where I was the first person to show up. Sometimes things get left behind. Supplies, tools, anything that gets overlooked in the rush. Still, I didn't like it. I stood up and moved on. The next room was open. Inside, the damage was minimal. A few scattered marks on the floor. A thin smear along one wall. I cleaned it quickly, methodically, making sure not to miss anything. When I finished, I stepped back and looked around. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the room, near the window, a bag, black, soft-sided, unzipped slightly at the top. My bag. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. It was the same one I'd brought with me, same shape, same worn edge along the bottom corner, where the fabric had started to fray. I looked down at my hands. My kit was still with me. Everything I'd brought was accounted for. So what was that? I approached it slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was moving towards something I didn't want to confirm. When I reached it, I didn't touch it immediately. I just looked. The zipper was partially open, just enough to see inside. Cloths, bottles, tools, arranged the same way I keep mine. I crouched down and pulled the zipper open a little more. Inside, there was a notebook, small, worn. I recognized it instantly. It was mine, not the one I carried now, an older one, the kind I used before I switched to the current one. I reached in and picked it up. The cover felt familiar, in a way that made my chest tighten slightly. I flipped it open. Addresses, dates, short notes, my handwriting. Every page filled the way I used to write them. Quick, minimal, just enough to remember. I turned a few pages, scanning without really reading. Then I stopped. One entry, no date, no note, just an address. The same one I was at now. I stared at it longer than I should have, trying to recall if I'd ever written it before, trying to place it somewhere in my memory. Nothing came back, no image, no job, no reason for it to be there. I closed the notebook slowly and set it back inside the bag. My bag, but not mine, not the one I had with me. I stood up and stepped away from it. The room felt different now, not heavier, just aware, like something had shifted, not in the space, but in what the space knew. I backed toward the door, while keeping my eyes on the bag. It didn't move, nothing changed, but the feeling stayed. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. The silence pressed in again, steady and controlled. I looked down at my hands, at the gloves I was still wearing, clean, intact, exactly the way they should be. Then I looked back at the door, at the room I'd just left, at the things inside it that shouldn't have been there. And for the first time since I arrived, a thought settled in that I couldn't push aside. Maybe I hadn't just been called here. Maybe I'd already been here before. And if that was true, then I didn't know what version of me had left that bag behind. The job that repeats. I didn't open that door again. There wasn't anything in that room I needed to confirm. I'd already seen enough. The bag, the notebook, the address written in my own handwriting. Going back in wouldn't change any of it. So I kept moving. The hallway felt steadier now. Not normal, but consistent. The doors stayed where they were. The distance between them didn't shift when I looked away. Whatever I'd done in the previous rooms had stabilized something, or at least slowed it down. I followed what remained of the trail, finishing each section the same way. Careful, complete, no shortcuts. By the time I reached the end, there wasn't much left to clean. Just one room. It was at the very end of the hallway, set slightly apart from the others. The door was closed. Unlike the rest, no marks on the floor leading to it. No visible signs of what might be inside. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then I opened it. The room was empty. No furniture, no stains, no smell. Just bare walls and a single window on the far side. For a second, I thought that was it, that I'd reached the end and there was nothing left to do. Then I noticed the floor, a faint outline, not a stain, more like a mark pressed into the surface. Barely visible unless the light hit it at the right angle. The shape was familiar, too familiar. I stepped closer without thinking. It was the size of a body, positioned exactly where someone might have fallen, or been placed. I knelt down slowly, running my gloved hand just above it without touching. There was no residue, no texture, just the impression of something that had been there long enough to leave a trace. I exhaled quietly and reached for the solution. Sprayed, waited, wiped, nothing changed. The outline didn't fade, didn't react at all. I tried again, same result. Yes, it wasn't something I could clean. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. If this was the last room, and this was the last thing left, then the job wasn't something I could finish. The thought settled in slowly, not sharp, just present. I stood up and looked around the room again, searching for anything I might have missed. Corners, walls, window frame, nothing. Completely empty. No hidden marks, no secondary stains, just that outline. I stepped back toward the door. The hallway outside looked the same as before. Quiet, still, waiting. I checked the rest of the house again. Living room, clean. Hallway, clean. Every room I'd worked in, clean. Nothing had come back. Nothing had changed. Except for this. I returned to the doorway and looked at the outline again. There was no progression here. No reaction. No way to complete it the way I had with everything else. Which meant one of two things. Either it wasn't part of the job, or it was the only part that mattered. My phone vibrated. The sound cut through the silence immediately. I pulled it out slowly. Same blank contact. Same empty signal. A message appeared. Final section. I looked down at the floor, at the outline, then back at the screen. Another message came through before I could respond. Complete it. I stared at the words, waiting for something else. An explanation. A detail. Anything that would tell me what that meant. Nothing came. I looked around the room again. There was nothing here I could use. Nothing I could clean. Nothing I could remove. Just the shape. Waiting. I stepped forward slowly, stopping just at the edge of it. The air felt different here. Not heavier, not lighter, just focused, like everything in the house had been building toward this one spot. I lowered myself down carefully, matching the position of the outline without fully committing to it. Testing. The moment my knee crossed into the space, something shifted. Not in the room, in the house. A subtle change, like something had recognized the movement. I froze, waited. Nothing else happened. I pulled back slightly, just enough to break contact with the shape. The feeling faded. I looked down at it again, then back at the door, at the hallway, at the path I'd taken to get here. Every room cleaned, every section finished, except this. And slowly, quietly, a realization settled in that I couldn't ignore anymore. The job hadn't been repeating. I had. And this was the part where it always ended. I stayed at the edge of the outline longer than I should have. Long enough for the silence in the house to feel different again. Not empty, not waiting. Just still in a way that felt final. Like everything had paused, holding itself in place. I knew what I was supposed to do. Not because anyone had said it clearly, but because every step before this had led here. Every room, every stain, every small correction the house had forced me to make. Finish everything, that was the rule. But this wasn't something I could clean, so finishing it meant something else. I stepped into the outline, fully this time, carefully lowering myself into position, matching the shape as closely as I could, back against the floor, arms at my sides, head angled slightly, the way the impression suggested. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air changed. Not around me, through me. A pressure settled in, subtle, but unmistakable, like the house had shifted its attention completely, focusing on one point instead of many. I kept still, breathing slow, controlled, the way I do when I need to steady my hands. It would pass. That's what I told myself. Everything else had. But then I made a mistake, a small one, the kind that doesn't feel like a mistake until it's already happened. I turned my head, just slightly, toward the doorway, toward the hallway beyond it, and I looked. There was someone standing there, not clearly, not fully, just a shape, positioned where the light from the hallway should have been, still, watching. I didn't react right away. My mind tried to process it, fit it into something familiar. Another reflection, a trick of the light. It's the same kind of misalignment I'd been noticing since I got here. But it didn't shift, didn't flicker. It stayed exactly where it was. And slowly, it became clearer. The outline of a person, standing just inside the doorway, facing me. I felt my chest tighten slightly, my breathing breaking rhythm for just a second. That was enough. The pressure in the room changed immediately, not stronger, sharper, like something had been waiting for that exact moment. I should have looked away. I knew that. Every part of me knew it. But I didn't. I kept looking, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to confirm it was real. The shape tilted its head, just slightly, mirroring the angle of mine. That's when I realized what I'd done. I hadn't just seen it, I'd acknowledged it. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't felt before. Not just silent, and empty, like all the sound had been removed completely. The shape in the doorway took a step forward. Slow, measured, not rushed. I pushed myself up from the floor, breaking contact with the outline without thinking. The moment I moved, the pressure in the room snapped back. Heavier now, less controlled. The figure stopped. Halfway between the door and where I'd been lying. It didn't move again, but it didn't disappear either. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to think through what had just happened. The rules. I'd been following them without fully understanding. Finish everything. Don't leave early. Don't look too long. And now, don't acknowledge. I had broken that one. And the house had responded. Not violently, not immediately, just differently. I glanced down at the floor. The outline was darker now, more defined, as if something had started to fill it. I looked back at the figure. It hadn't moved, still watching, still angled slightly, matching me in a way that felt too precise to be coincidence. I took a step back. It didn't follow. Another step. Still nothing. But the distance between us didn't feel right, like the space was adjusting again, quietly correcting something I couldn't see. I stopped moving. The room held still. The figure remained. And in that moment, one thought settled in, clear and unavoidable. I hadn't just broken a rule. I'd changed my place in the house. And whatever was standing in that doorway wasn't just watching me anymore. Someone has to stay. I didn't move, not because I couldn't, but because there wasn't anywhere left to go that felt different from where I already was. The room, the hallway, the rest of the house, it had all settled into something stable, something finished. The figure in the doorway hadn't taken another step. It just stood there, slightly angled, like it was waiting for something I hadn't done yet, or something I had. I looked down at the outline again. It was darker now, not just more visible, filled in. The shape wasn't empty anymore. It had weight to it, presence, like it had been waiting for something to complete it. I understood then, not all at once, just enough. The job wasn't about cleaning. It never had been. That was just the part they let you believe at the beginning. Something simple, something manageable. You go in, you fix what's left behind, and you leave. But this place didn't want to be fixed. It wanted to be maintained. I glanced back at the figure, still there, still watching, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. Not exactly. It felt familiar, like looking at something you recognize without remembering where from. I took a slow breath and stepped forward again, back into the outline. This time, I didn't hesitate. I lowered myself into position, matching it the same way I had before, back against the floor, arms at my sides, head tilted just slightly. The moment I settled in, the pressure returned. Not sharp this time. Even, balanced, like everything had found where it was supposed to be. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The cracks in it formed lines that didn't quite connect, like they'd been interrupted and redrawn over time. I focused on those, letting my breathing slow, letting everything else fall into the background. The house felt quiet again, not empty, just complete. After a few seconds, I turned my head. Carefully, the doorway was empty. The figure was gone. I didn't feel relief, just confirmation. I stayed where I was. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. It was hard to tell. Time didn't move the same way here. It stretched, shifted, like everything else in the house. Eventually, I heard something, faint, distant, a sound I hadn't noticed before, a door opening, not in this room, somewhere else, followed by footsteps, slow, careful, the same way mine had been. I didn't sit up, didn't move. I already knew what it meant. Someone else had arrived. The thought didn't come with panic or urgency, just understanding. That's how it continues. Not by repeating the same moment exactly, but by replacing what's missing. I listened as the footsteps moved through the house, pausing, starting again. The same pattern I'd followed, the same hesitation, the same attempts to make sense of it. I wanted to say something, to warn them, to tell them not to follow the path I had. But I didn't. I couldn't. The rules weren't just for surviving, they were for staying. And now I was part of them. The air shifted slightly as the footsteps got closer. Not in a physical way, just awareness, like the house was adjusting to the new presence. I stared at the ceiling, at the lines that didn't connect. And slowly, something else settled in. A detail I hadn't noticed before. Near the edge of the room, just within view, a dark mark on the floor. Faint, but forming. Not where I was, somewhere else. Waiting. I understood it immediately. That would be theirs. The start of their job. The first thing they'd try to clean. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not to rest, just to think. But the thought didn't last, because it didn't matter anymore. The house would guide them the same way it guided me, step by step, room by room, until they understood what I had. I opened my eyes again, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant movement, and as the sound of their footsteps grew clearer, one final realization settled in quietly. This place doesn't trap people, it replaces them. And now that I was here, I couldn't remember what it felt like to leave.